The ad read itself like a trap. Farm for sale, fully furnished, staff on site, ready for immediate move. In. What it didn't say was this. The staff were 3 women, each of them over 6 feet tall, built like oxen, and already calling the place home. And when he stepped across the threshold, still clutching the deed, the tallest one looked him dead in the eye and said flatly, "You'll be sharing our bed." He thought it was a joke, but the smirk never came. Neither did mercy. What kind of deal had he just walked into, and could he ever walk out again? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Jonas Bell rode up the dirt track with the sun beating down on his weathered hat, his horse lathered from the long journey, and the folded deed burning a hopeful weight in his vest pocket, the very paper that he believed would at last secure him peace from a world that had done little more than grind him down. Yet when the farmhouse finally came into view, a broad-shouldered structure sitting quiet among wind-bent grasses and leaning fence posts, his chest loosened with something that almost felt like gratitude. But the moment he dismounted and stepped onto the warped porch boards, his boot heels stirring dust into the still air, that fragile sense of relief shattered, for the front door swung open before he could even knock, revealing Darla, a statuesque woman with iron-gray hair braided tight, and eyes that met his with the kind of steadiness that told him she'd already taken the measure of who he was and found him wanting. And behind her, like shadows cut from different cloth, stood May, sharp-faced with dark curls that refused to stay bound, and Rue, younger, softer at first glance but with a wary tension in her stance that suggested she had teeth enough to bite if pressed. Jonas stammered his name, pulled the deed from his pocket as though it were proof of his right to exist there. But Darla only crossed her arms and tilted her chin, saying in a voice that left no room for argument, "You'll be sharing our bed." Words that struck him harder than any fist. For he had expected neighbors at worst, squatters perhaps, but not this brazen claim of ownership over his nights. May's lips twitched in a smile that was not quite kind, and Rue's gaze flicked away, as though embarrassed for him. But Jonas, red to the ears and fumbling for dignity, insisted there must be some mistake, that he had bought this land fair and square, that he wanted nothing but solitude, quiet evenings, and the chance to work soil without voices crowding his silence. Yet Darla's eyes narrowed as if she could read every crack in his story, every lie he told himself about wanting to be alone, and she stepped closer until he could smell the faint trace of sage on her skin, telling him there was no misunderstanding, that the contract he had signed came with more than land, that it came with them, bound together by something older than law and more dangerous than mere coincidence. And though Jonas tried to laugh it off, his voice sounded thin in the wide room behind her, where quilts lay tangled on a broad bed too large for any single body, and a chill ran through him despite the swelter of the afternoon. For the house no longer felt like sanctuary but like a mouth yawning open to swallow him whole. And still, with nowhere else to go and pride forcing him to stand his ground, he clenched the deed tighter, squared his shoulders against the heat of 3 gazes, and told himself he would not be bullied out of what was his, though a whisper of doubt curled cold around his heart, wondering if he had ridden not into freedom, but into a trap disguised as home. Jonas stood at the battered kitchen table, the deed to the land trembling between his fingers like a shield made of paper, his voice hoarse as he repeated his claim of rightful ownership, the words growing thinner each time they left his lips, until Darla, with a patience that felt more like warning, laid down a thick, weather-cracked document on the scarred wood, its edges frayed and yellowed with age, the ink faded but legible, a thing altogether different from the tidy legal deed Jonas had brought. For this contract was handwritten in looping script, signed by the late owner, and marked with a seal pressed deep into the page, a seal Jonas knew well from the county office, though here it seemed like something older, heavier, more binding than bureaucratic formality. The words across the top read not of purchase or transfer, but of bequeathal, promising the land and the house to whoever keeps it whole, a phrase that snagged at Jonas's mind like a thorn in wool, because what in God's name did whole mean when applied to dirt, fence posts, and timber? Yet Darla only tapped the page, saying this was the true law of the land, that the women had tended it long before he showed up with his worn boots and broken pride. And May, her dark eyes glinting with both suspicion and challenge, leaned forward, her arms corded with strength earned from years of labor, and told him that legal parchment alone didn't make a man fit to hold a place, that if he wanted a place among them, he'd have to prove it not just to their eyes but to the land itself, earning not only his keep but his belonging. Jonas scoffed, though the sound died quickly in the room's stillness, and he demanded to know what such proof entailed. But May only smiled sharp and thin, saying that the soil had ears, the walls had memory, and the dead still walked in the rafters, and that he would be tested by them, by the farm, by something deeper than law. Rue shifted uneasily, her youthful face torn between sympathy and the unspoken fear that Jonas would fail, while Darla's expression never changed, her gaze steady as an anvil, her tone quiet but final, when she told him he could walk away now, keep his papers and his pride, or stay and learn what whole really meant. Though if he stayed, he would find the bed was only the beginning, and Jonas, clutching his tidy county deed like a drowning man to driftwood, felt the weight of both parchments pressing against him, the clean, legal line he thought his salvation, and the crooked, haunted script that bound him not to solitude, but to the women and the restless soil beneath his boots. And though every instinct screamed to turn and ride until the farmhouse was a memory in the distance, he found himself staring at May's challenge, at the dare burning in her eyes, and against his better judgment, Jonas heard his own voice say he would stay. The morning sun broke sharp and merciless over the prairie when Darla led Jonas to the east fence, its posts split and scattered from the last storm, rails broken like bones in the dirt, wire snarled in cruel coils, a ruin stretching across the land that seemed more graveyard than boundary. And when she told him plainly that this was his first task if he meant to remain, her tone bore the weight of a sentence passed, not an offer made. May standing a few yards off with her arms folded tight and her eyes narrowed, saying nothing yet speaking volumes in the curl of her lip and the doubt that clung to her silence, while Rue leaned against a fence post still upright, her mouth curved with sly amusement as she called out little jabs. "Hope you brought more muscle than that, city paper man. And careful, or the fence'll whip you harder than the land itself," words that pricked his pride like thorns and made his jaw clench. But Jonas said nothing, only unrolled his sleeves and set to work, the hammer and wire cutter in his calloused hands heavier than they ought to have been, each stroke driving sweat into his eyes, each pull of the wire cutting fresh lines across his palms until the blood slicked dark against iron. Yet still he pushed on, teeth gritted, back bent, as though the work itself might swallow the doubt in his chest. May's gaze never left him, her silence more cutting than Rue's barbs, while Darla sat steady on an overturned bucket, eyes cool, expression unreadable, like a judge at some unspoken trial. And Jonas labored on beneath their scrutiny, the sun a brand on his neck, his muscles quaking, his breath coming ragged, until hours later, long after he thought his body might give, the last post was sunk, the final rail nailed, and the fence stood once more like a scar stitched across the land, uneven but whole, and Jonas, filthy, bleeding, near broken, leaned against it with a laugh that came out more like a sob, for he had done it, impossible as it seemed. That night, the women met him at the farmhouse door, Darla speaking for them all as she said he had earned a place within the house, her voice neither warm nor cold, but edged with something like respect. May's nod curt but acknowledging, Rue's grin softer now, though still sly. Yet Jonas, stubborn as the stone in the fields, shook his head, muttered that he wanted no bed but his own, and turned from the lamplight glow of the hearth to the dark barn beyond, where the smell of hay and horse was sharp in the chill air. And as he lay upon the rough boards with the ache of his wounds singing him toward uneasy sleep, he tried to believe it was choice, not fear, that kept him from their bed, though the silence between the rafters pressed close, and he wondered if the land itself was watching to see if he would rise again come dawn. The saloon air was thick with smoke and the clatter of glasses when Jonas, stiff from days of labor and pride, still raw from sleeping on straw instead of a bed, leaned against the bar and tried to drink down the ache in his bones. But the barkeep, a square-jawed man with a scar tugging at the corner of his mouth, poured him whiskey with a shake of the head and said low, as if reluctant to waste words, that no man had lasted more than a season on that stretch of land, Jonas now claimed. Not one who came with title papers or sheriff's blessing, for all of them had either been run off or broken. And Jonas, bristling, demanded to know what that meant. But the barkeep only gave a shrug heavy with years, muttering that the three women, Darla, May, and Rue, weren't right, that some said they were witches who drew blood under moonlight. Others whispered they had murdered the last rightful owner and buried him under the east fence. And still more muttered, half joking, half fearful, that they were government experiments from the war years, made to look like women but carrying secrets in their marrow. Jonas scoffed aloud, but unease clamped around his ribs, tightening with every sip, and when he pressed for details, the barkeep leaned closer, eyes flinty, saying only this: "If the land doesn't kill you, they will." And though Jonas laughed too loudly to mask his discomfort, he left the saloon with the words lodged like burrs under his skin, suspicion riding him hard as he mounted up and made his way back, the wind keening across the plains like a warning. Yet when the farmhouse came into sight, the unease faltered, for in the yard the three women were bent, not over some occult ritual or hidden grave, but over the sick horse Jonas had bought with his last dime, the animal he had believed a poor investment already doomed, its sides heaving with fever, eyes rolling wild. But Darla knelt steady with a rag soaked in cool water, pressing it against the horse's neck. May held its head firm, though her strength was tempered with gentleness, and Rue whispered in a low, soothing voice as she rubbed the beast's trembling flank, their hands and voices working in a rhythm older than suspicion. And when Jonas dismounted, his first words sharp with doubt, Darla only looked up, her expression as hard as stone but her hands still tending the creature, saying nothing in her defense, while May cut him a glance sharp enough to flay his pride, and Rue, without pausing her soft murmur to the horse, said simply, "He'll live if we keep at it." And Jonas, standing there with the barkeep's rumors curdling in his mind, felt the ground tilt beneath him, torn between the poison of town gossip and the plain, undeniable truth of what lay before his eyes. Three women giving care where he had nearly given up, their strength bound not by malice but by something he could not yet name, though it struck him then that the land might judge not by rumor but by the hands willing to heal it. And he found himself stepping closer despite the cold seed of fear sprouting in his chest. The summer came down heavy on the plains, pressing every living thing beneath its furnace breath, and within the walls of the Rawley place, the heat did more than curl paint and sour milk, it stoked tempers, especially between Jonas and May, whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes seemed to find fault in every nail he drove crooked, every furrow plowed uneven, every pause he dared to take in the fields, their quarrels flaring like lightning in the still air, words spat about chores, boundaries, respect, until even Rue rolled her eyes and Darla, stone-faced as always, let the arguments burn themselves out like brush fires she wouldn't bother to stamp. Yet despite the constant clashing, May seemed to draw Jonas in as much as she pushed him back, her strength and stubbornness a mirror of his own, and one sweltering night when the air was too hot for sleep, she marched him out behind the barn with 2 rifles and a lantern, laying down the challenge in a voice as cool as well water. A shooting contest at tin cans lined along the fence, her tone daring him to prove himself not just with sweat and calluses but with precision, with grit, with the kind of edge that could defend a place worth keeping. Jonas took the dare, his pride too raw to refuse, and though he fired true, May's shots sang sharper, her cans toppling clean in the dark while his wavered or missed, and when she lowered her rifle with a smile that was both smug and strangely inviting, he bit down his frustration, muttering excuses about the lantern light, though he knew the truth plain he'd been beaten, and May knew it. Yet before the sting of defeat could sour the night further, the thunder of hooves and the harsh cackle of strange voices split the stillness, bandits riding in fast and reckless, their eyes on the corral where the Rawley horses stamped and snorted in panic, and with May too far off reloading and Darla still rushing from the house, It was Jonas who found himself between Rue and the raiders, no rifle at hand, only a shovel leaning in the dirt, which he seized with both hands and swung with a desperation that was half courage, half fury. The first bandit toppled from his saddle with a grunt. The second cursed as Jonas jabbed the iron edge into his gut. The third turned tail at the sight of this lanky fool fighting like a man possessed. And by the time May came running with her rifle, the threat had scattered, leaving only the dust of retreating hooves, and Jonas gasping, bloodied, but standing, Rue clinging to his arm with wide eyes and a gratitude that struck deeper than any victory at tin cans. Later, when the house quieted and the horses settled, Darla placed a firm hand on Jonas's shoulder and told him he had earned more than the barn shadows that night. May silent but watchful as Rue led him inside. And though he lay stiff at first beneath the weight of quilts and the women's nearness, the scent of wood smoke and lavender filling his lungs, Jonas felt something shift, as though the land itself had acknowledged his claim not in ink or seal, but in blood, sweat, and the stubborn beating of his heart. The night after the bandits' raid, when the heat had finally loosened its grip and the prairie wind slipped cool through the open windows, Jonas found himself on the porch steps with Rue, her slender frame curled against the post, the glow of lamplight brushing her face while the others slept inside. And for the first time since his arrival, she spoke more than teasing jabs or quick remarks. Her voice hushed, steady, as though unburdening secrets to the night itself. She told him how she had once been a showgirl in a traveling act called Giants of the Frontier, a cruel spectacle of human oddities meant to dazzle frontier crowds. Her role to sing and smile in glittering costumes while men leered and children stared, until a rail tycoon with more money than mercy decided she was worth owning outright, pressing a contract as binding as chains. Her name inked without her consent, her body reduced to property to be displayed on any stage he chose. And it was Darla and May who had found her the night she tried to run, her dress torn, her lips split from the tycoon's heavy hand. And they had taken her in, hidden her, and stood firm when hired men came sniffing, their defiance not of law but of something greater, the right to protect their own. Rue's eyes glistened in the dim light, though her voice carried no tremor when she told Jonas, "We're not here for comfort. We're here to survive." Words that struck him harder than May's barbs or Darla's judgments, for they rang with truth, unvarnished and undeniable. And as he listened, the pieces began to shift into place. The bed they shared was not indulgence but solidarity. The rules they enforced, not cruelty but a bulwark against a world eager to consume them. And the land itself, harsh and relentless, was more than soil. It was a sanctuary carved out of danger, a place where survival meant unity, vigilance, and sacrifice. Jonas sat silent for a long moment, the weight of her story pressing down, the deed in his vest pocket suddenly feeling like a child's claim compared to the blood and fear that had rooted these women here. And when Rue leaned her head against his shoulder, not with seduction but with the weary ease of trust, he realized with a clarity that unsettled and steadied him all at once that he was not merely wrestling for land, nor even for belonging, but for a chance to stand guard at the edge of something sacred, something fragile and fierce all at once. And though his pride still bristled, some deeper part of him began to yield, whispering that perhaps he had not found the refuge he wanted, but the one he needed, a truth that made the night air taste sharper, cleaner, as if the prairie itself had been waiting for him to understand. The storm came without warning, a wall of dust rising on the horizon like the end of days, blotting out the sky until noon looked like midnight. And by the time Jonas and the women barred the shutters and stuffed rags under the door frames, the house was swallowed whole, every creak of timber drowned in the howl of grit-laden wind, days blurring into nights as they huddled together in the dim lamplight with nothing but canned beans, tepid water, and the closeness of each other's breath to remind them the world still spun outside. Tension thickened in that confinement, tempers fraying like rope under strain, Rue snapping at May's sharp commands, May bristling under Darla's calm authority, Jonas himself pacing like a caged animal until at last, on the second night, his anger burst in a shout that was more grief than rage. words tumbling raw as he confessed the truth he had buried since setting eyes on the place that he had not come chasing dreams of solitude or prosperity, but fleeing ghosts. A failed ranch where cattle starved under his watch, a wife buried too soon in stony ground, debts that gnawed his name down to nothing, and a man hollowed by shame who thought maybe land and silence could patch the cracks. The words hung heavy, and for the first time Darla's eyes softened, her hands folding slow in her lap as she told him in a voice as steady as prayer, "You didn't buy this farm, Jonas. You were called here." A statement so simple and strange it silenced the storm in his chest, though the wind still raged outside. Silence stretched, broken only by Rue's quiet sobs, May's breath hitching as if she too carried a burden unspoken. And Jonas, stripped of pride, felt the house itself bend around them, not as prison but as crucible, forging something harsher and stronger than blood or law. That night, when the chill crept deeper into the boards and blankets failed to keep it at bay, he did not retreat to the barn or his corner cot but lay with them in the wide, tangled bed, at first out of necessity, warmth shared against the cold that seeped through every crack. But as hours passed and Rue curled trustfully against his arm, May's breath softened steady at his back, and Darla's presence anchored them all like a hearthstone. The closeness shifted, no longer mere survival but a binding, a tacit trust that asked nothing and offered everything. And as Jonas closed his eyes, his grief did not vanish, his failures did not dissolve, but they no longer seemed to own him. For in that bed, in that storm, he belonged, however strange, however unexpected, and the land itself seemed to sigh around them, dust battering the walls like a drumbeat of witness. The storm had barely cleared when trouble came riding. A half-dozen men from town led by Sheriff Colburn, a bitter old hound with whiskey on his breath and suspicion in his eyes, their boots raising dust in the yard as they shouted for the women to come out and release Jonas from whatever spell had chained him there, voices dripping with sanctimony but sharpened by envy and fear. For the rumors he'd heard in the saloon had festered into something harder, something armed. Jonas stepped out before Darla could, his arms still aching from the storm's long labor but his back straight, his voice raw as he told them he was no prisoner, that the land was his to share, his to defend. But the sheriff only sneered, muttering about witchcraft and ungodly beds, his hand never straying far from the pistol at his hip, and in that charged silence the world seemed to hold its breath until one twitch, one flinch, was all it took, a shot cracking loud and hot through the air. Rue's cry tearing from the porch as the bullet grazed her arm, blood welling bright against her pale skin, and Jonas's heart snapped like kindling, fury flooding his veins as he lunged forward, shoving Darla back just as another gun barked, the lead searing through his own arm in a flash of pain so white it nearly dropped him. But he kept his footing, teeth clenched, shovel still in his good hand from the work he'd abandoned, and before the sheriff's men could press their advantage, May was on them, moving like a storm-given flesh, her rifle forgotten as she caught one man by the wrist and twisted until bone cracked like a dry branch, his scream cutting high, the others faltering at the sight of her ferocity. Darla's voice rose steady, commanding, cutting through the chaos with words that carried weight beyond sound, while Rue, bloodied but defiant, flung a rock that split another man's brow, and together they turned the tide, Jonas swinging his shovel with a wild determination, each strike not elegant but desperate and true, until the invaders stumbled back, cursing, clutching wounds, and finally broke, their retreat a ragged flight under the hard gaze of the women they had come to unmake. In the settling silence, the yard strewn with trampled dust and blood, Jonas staggered but stayed upright, his arms slick and burning, Darla's hand firm at his back, May's breath coming ragged as she wiped Rue's blood from her fingers. And though they were battered, they were not broken. The four of them bound now not by rumor or law, but by blood spilled in common defense, the fire of survival still smoldering in their eyes. And as the sheriff's curses faded into distance, Jonas understood with bone-deep certainty that whatever called him here had marked him, claimed him, and he had answered, not as owner, but as part of the whole. Recovery came slow. The bullets trail through Jonas's arm, leaving fire in its wake. But in those long days of mending, the house that had once felt like a trap became a cradle of care, each of the women tending him in ways that stitched him deeper into their circle. Rue sitting cross-legged by his cot with a book borrowed from some forgotten shelf, her voice lilting as she read aloud tales of voyages and trials, pausing only to laugh at his muttered commentary, the sound easing the ache in ways no poultice could. May, once his fiercest adversary, now came with bandages and broth, her movements brusque but steady, her eyes meeting his with a respect that needed no words. And though she still scolded when he tried to rise too soon, the sharpness had shifted into something protective, almost proud. Darla, quiet anchor of them all, brought him to the fields when he could walk again, guiding his hand to the soil, showing him how to feel its dampness, its hunger, its pulse, telling him that to touch the land was to hear its truth. And for the first time Jonas felt it not just dirt, but something alive, something that seemed to stir under his fingers as if acknowledging his place. The days stretched into weeks, the wounds knit shut, and with strength returning, he joined them in the work of repairing what the storm and violence had left broken. The most important task, the rebuilding of the front gate, splintered by bullets and boots, now raised anew under 4 sets of hands, their sweat mingling as beams were lifted and nails driven, laughter ringing sharp when Jonas misswung his hammer and Rue teased him back into rhythm, the air filled with a sense of making not just structure but covenant. When the final beam was set, Darla handed him the carving knife, and together they etched their initials deep into the fresh wood: D for Darla, M for May, R for Rue, J for Jonas, the letters crude but proud. A mark that bound them not by rumor or paper but by will, by labor, by survival shared. When the last curl of wood fell, they stood shoulder to shoulder before the gate, the prairie wind whipping their hair and clothes, the sun sinking gold behind them, and Jonas felt something unnameable swell in his chest, a belonging he had never earned before, not in law, not in loss, but here, where the land no longer felt like his to claim, but theirs to hold together, a sanctuary carved out of dust, sweat, and blood. And for the first time since his wife's grave closed over him, Jonas Bell let himself believe he was home. Autumn rolled in with cooler winds and fields burnished gold, and by the time the leaves of the old pecan tree rattled dry above the yard, word had spread through the county that something unusual, something defiant was about to take place at the Rawley farm, drawing townsfolk in wary clusters to the fence line, not close enough to claim blessing but too curious to stay away. Their whispers snagging like thorns in the breeze as Jonas stood beneath the broad tree with Darla, May, and Rue. No preacher, no papers, no rings, just 4 people bound by trials, blood, and the stubborn will to endure. Their hands linked together in a circle that closed out the doubts of the world beyond. Jonas, clean-shaven and dressed in his mended best, felt his pulse thunder not with fear but with something steadier, a quiet pride that no longer belonged to him alone but to them all. May's grip firm and sure as steel, Rue's fingers trembling slightly yet warm with trust, Darla's hand strong and steady as the land itself, and when the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in a blaze of copper and crimson, Darla's voice rose above the silence, low but carrying, words that seemed less spoken than laid into the soil. This land has always been about more than land. It's about who's strong enough to stay, a truth that rippled outward, through the watching crowd, through the roots of the pecan tree, through the hearts of those who had come doubting and left unsettled. For none dared step forward, none dared challenge what had been forged by storm, by fire, by blood and bone. Instead, they lingered in silence, witnesses to something they could neither bless nor condemn, until one by one they drifted back toward town, their murmurs swallowed by the wind, leaving Jonas and the women standing beneath the spreading branches as night crept in, the land around them hushed but alive, a sanctuary made whole not by law or tradition but by endurance, by trust, by the unyielding fact that 4 initials carved into wood and 4 hands clasped together were as binding as any vow. And as the first stars flared in the sky, Jonas knew with a certainty that no contract could grant nor rumor undo that he was not a visitor, not an interloper, but kin, a man remade not in solitude but in the fierce, unbreakable bond of those who had chosen to stay.